you will never see the story of Yosef and his brothers in the same light after this Sikha. And the Rebbe uses this as an opportunity to show us a revolutionary insight into what Hasidus Chabad is all about. The Pasuk tells us that his brothers were envious of him, and his father guarded the matter. Says the Medrash, Shtei Medrash, Omer Rabbi Levi. Rabbi Levi says, what happened at this point? What does it mean that Yaakov kind of guarded the matter? Natal Kulmas, he took a quill, because of Be'ez Yom, Be'ez Shah, Be'ez Mokim, and he recorded the day, the time, and the place that this event happened. So the Hechach in Pirush HaMedrash, Dr. Yefei Torah, the Yefei Torah, which is one of the commentators on the Medrash, explains why did the Medrash have to give us this explanation. Lefi shalot tipol shmira b'ma she'eino mitzvah chutz lenefesh, and explains because the term shmira, to guard something, is only relevant if it's something outside of your person. Therefore, the Medrash explained the word shomar literally. It means to keep something in your memory. In other words, what is shmira? Shmira means something that you've got to, it's not tangible, so you've got to remember it somewhere, you've got to hold on to it somewhere in your memory. Because we are not, unfortunately, in complete control of our memories, unless we make some kind of a symbol, some kind of a mark to remind us, that's why Yaakov Avinu wrote down, so he'd remember exactly when and where this dream occurred. Now the question is, so why did he write those details? The time, the place. So the Medrash gives another explanation. Because as the Gemara Brachos tells us, a person should anticipate up to 22 years to see the fulfillment of a dream. And in fact, we learn it from this dream from Yosef. When Yaakov hat es gewusst allein misvara. Now, of course, Yaakov hadn't yet learned the Gemara Brachos in the format of Gemara Brachos, but he understood, for whatever reason, he understood logically that a dream has 22 years within which to be fulfilled. That's why you had to record the time the dream happened, so you'd know how long can we wait and hope for this dream to be fulfilled. The Medrash says the Rebbe doesn't really seem to make sense. We still need to understand two key things over here. Let's first look at the first explanation, which was that Yaakov Avinu has to write it down so he remembers. Surely, what you want to remember is what the dream was about. Recording when and where it happened is a detail that's not relevant to the actual dream. Surely the Medrash should have told us that Yaakov Avinu wrote down what the dream was and then when it happened. Doesn't say that, just says he wrote when and where. Number two, Beis. When you have the second explanation, which is that you've got 22 years to anticipate it, that only makes the question bigger. If you're calculating a maximum of 22 years, surely you have to know now which year it is and which month it is, so you can tell when 22 years are up. To know how long you can hope for this dream to be fulfilled. When the 22 years will end. The day and the hour is not necessarily relevant to that calculation. The Medrash doesn't say anything about recording the year or the month. So the Yefei Torah does address this by saying, the fact that the Medrash says that he wrote the day and the hour, obviously he must have also written the month and the year. It's very strange to imagine that the Medrash would not have told us that key information and expected us to extrapolate it on our own. Now there are other commentators on the Medrash as well, and they also need to be explained. The Pirush of the Marazov, which is from the 18th century, Pirush on Medrash Shabbat. As Rabbi Levi learned up, the language that the Medrash should have used is that or the pasuk should have used, instead of saying Shomar, that he guarded the thing, it should have said that he remembered the thing or he believed in the fulfillment of the dream. Therefore, he says the word Shomar is associated with a Shamir, which is a means of etching. Similar to the pasuk that talks about the Yirmiyahu speaking of recording the sins of the Jewish people with the nail of a shamir. And because this was a prophetic dream, therefore it could be interpreted like various other prophecies prior to this. And therefore, it's appropriate for him to write it down, like the whole of Sefer Bereshis was written, at least according to one opinion in the Gemara, in segments. So here he's writing down this segment, and then, of course, recording it for posterity. Now, even with this explanation, it doesn't resolve our questions. The fact is, you still should have written down, or Yaakov should have recorded, what the content of the dream was. And and also the fact that the year and the month, which are key to calculating the time frame, are missing. Didn't answer those questions. So there are other interpretations, but they also don't answer our questions. In addition, we have to understand according to this explanation. If you're telling me that Yaakov wrote it down because the Torah was written Megillas, why is this the only nevuah that we have any record in the Sefer Bereshis that somebody wrote it down? It's a dream prophecy, and that's why it should be written down and learnt. Why is it that this is the time that the Torah emphasizes that Yaakov wrote it down? And why is that different from the other under nevuos of Sefer Bereshis, the whole Sefer Bereshis? Why is that different from the rest of the nevuos in Sefer Bereshis, or for that matter, the whole Sefer Bereshis, where the Torah does not tell us that anybody recorded the stories as they happened? We have no record that Avram, Yitzchak, or Yaakov wrote down their nevuos. What would be so unique about the nevuah of Yosef that it has to be written down? So to get to explain the Medrash, we actually have to ask a broader, very important question about the entire story. Seeing as Yosef knew that his brothers disliked him, Vayisnu, as the Torah tells us, why did he even tell them the dreams? What, just to egg them on? Surely he knew that was only going to agitate them and cause them more dislike. Especially since after he told them the first dream, and they now started to hate him more. Why does he go tell them the second dream? Surely he doesn't want to instigate more. So one of the explanations that's brought in Mefarshim, like the Barbanel and the Rachaim and others, is that's exactly the point. And this is a fascinating explanation. Yosef had gewusst as seine Brüder seine Moshe. Yosef knew exactly where he stood with his brothers, and they didn't like him. When Yosef had when he has this dream about all of their sheaves in the field coming to bow to his. And Yosef knows that the fulfillment of a dream is actually dependent on how you say its interpretation. And if you're going to give the most literal interpretation, then you can interpret any which way you want, because if it's an easy dream to interpret. Is therefore therefore he told them the dream specifically. He said it to them, not to somebody else, because he wanted them to interpret the dream in a way that would be satisfactory to them. Fascinating explanation. But that doesn't answer the entire flow of the story, because see how the Shvatim did interpret the dream. What, are you going to rule over us? Are you going to be a king over us? Why did they not then try and interpret the second dream? He offers it to them, they don't say a word. And a similar question in reverse. With regards to Yaakov. Yaakov only addressed and tried to interpret the second dream. We don't even have any evidence that Yosef even told Yaakov Avinu the first dream. Shloimar, as the Rebbe, hat Yaakov Poise given them Tzveiten Choloim. That's actually the reason why Yaakov interpreted the second dream, where he said, what do you think, me and your mother and your brothers all going to come bow to you on the ground? The reason he interpreted it was because the Shvatim had not interpreted it. So what's going on over here? Why is Yosef antagonizing them? Why do they Bechlal interpret the dream in a way that is not suitable to them? Why don't they interpret the second dream? Why does Yaakov interpret the second dream and not the first? Possibly Yosef doesn't even tell him the first. And let's add a layer. Seeing as the way that Yaakov interpreted the dream was as a rhetorical question, and even to the extent that the pasuk tells us that Yaakov was kind of dismissive of the dream, almost like denigrating the dream. As Rashi tells us, that he wanted to downplay the dream so that the brothers wouldn't hate or be envious of Yosef. And that's why he wrote it down. He recorded when the dream happened, because he is now interpreting the dream correctly, which is that they are going to come bow down to Yosef. So even though he's trying to diminish the fallout with the brothers, he's recording that this is actually what the dream means. Because Yaakov wants to preserve that rhetorical question around this dream. And when will it happen? When are we going to land up bowing to you? As far as that would actually explain why he didn't have to write down the content of the dream. Because he already spelled out the content. He is the one who said, doesn't mean we'll come bow to you. Es ist nur aksiva if zu bestätigen das Kavanosse bei Pissen is kiyum b'mitzvah sadavar. Why is Yaakov writing it down? Because he's waiting for it to happen, which means he's endorsing the dream and he's supporting the dream and he's waiting to see the dream. He doesn't have to interpret the dream in writing because he's already interpreted the dream. Es bleibt aber nicht musbar, but what we don't understand is was ist der Time, as Yaakov hat ausgekriegt zu verschreiben, darf gedi protim. If Yaakov wants to record the dream, because he anticipates its fulfillment, and he believes it's correct that the brothers should bow to Yosef at some point, why is he writing these specific details? Beis Yoim, the day, Beis Shah, the time, Beis Mokim, the place, instead of the year and the month. To understand that, we're going to look at a broad concept of how the behavior and stories of the Avos affect us as their descendants. Shloimar explanation is let's first unpack properly this concept that the stories of our forefathers are indicators to their descendants, which is us, about what's going to happen in our lives. In it means that the events and experiences of the Jewish people throughout history is just they indicated that these things would happen, and the empowerment of people that these things should happen to us is from the Meiser Shleisha Ha'avos, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, was all empowered by the behavior and experiences of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Now, that shows that there's a very strong connection between the Avos and their children, their events and our events. The link between the experiences of our forefathers and our experiences is that interrelationship is like the interrelationship between a father and a son in the human world. And the relationship between father and son has 3 stages. Most people don't think along these lines. Stage 1 is when the child hasn't yet not only been formed, hasn't yet been conceived, the child is part of the material of the father's brain. At that point, the child doesn't exist as an entity, and certainly doesn't exist with all the components that make up a human being called the child. At that stage, all the child is part of the father's brain, as people colloquially say, before you were thought of. That is the one stage, the first stage. Then there's the third stage, the opposite extreme. Then the child becomes an independent entity with his, as we call, 10 fingers and 10 toes, or as we say in Torah, 248 limbs, 365 sinews. Now, every element, every piece of DNA, every cell in the body of that child is material from the father, including the nails, as Alter Rebbe says in Tanya. But the fact is, the child becomes an independent entity who lives outside of and independent of the father. Then Gimel Dimadrega Memutzas, in between those two stages, is a bridging stage. That is the bridge between how the child originates as part of the father's brain, with the part of the child that will emerge as an independent person. That bridge occurs in the months of pregnancy. Of course, the whole purpose of pregnancy is to allow the development of this independent human called the child. The different limbs take form. The child depreciates from being this high potential cell of creation to becoming the specific human they're going to become. Again, to paraphrase Alter Rebbe, it goes through various evolutionary processes until eventually from this dynamic, creative material, you get something as dead as nails. But where is it occurring? It's occurring in the place of the fertilization that came from the seed that was developed out of the father's brain. Because of that bridge, even afterwards, throughout the person's entire life, is the child and every facet of the child still retains an indelible link to the father's brain. As Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, even with regards to the nails of the child who's already living independently of the father, the Alter Rebbe says, even now in the child's experience, the nurture and the growth and the vitality of the nails, that is all driven from the brain of the child, which is plugged in, obviously, to the brain of the father. The brain of the child is, if you wish, like the nucleus, like the essence of the father's seed that developed into the child. So those are the three stages. There's a stage where a child doesn't exist. It's purely potential in the father's brain. There's a stage where the child is completely independent, but has DNA inside of themselves, that is the DNA of the father. And there's a bridging state where the child is developing, but developing in the realm of the father's genetic material, and therefore is bridging between being part of the father and becoming its own entity. That's how it is in father-to-child relationships, and we're going to use that as a template to understand how it is in the Avos to Banim relationship that we have with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. This illustrates to us the relationship between the Avos and us, and therefore their avoida and our avoida. So we have a principle that there are only 3 tzaddikim in the whole of history who have the title Avos. There's a certain level where we are actually incorporated within them. We don't have our own identity. We belong to them. Especially Yaakov Avinu, who is considered the choicest out of the Avos. And there's this beauty of Yaakov Avinu which reflects the beauty of Adam Harishon, meaning, just as Adam Harishon contained within himself the neshama of every human across the span of history, Yaakov Avinu contains within himself the neshama of every single Jewish person throughout history. Now, when I'm looking at us, at the root of our neshama, there is no independent or individualized avoid at this point, where you are more of a maskil and you are more of an oived and you're more a Torah and you're more a uvdin tavin. There's none of that distinction. The Jewish people are a continuum of the actions of the forefathers. But then, in order for us to achieve what we're supposed to do here in this world, we all emerge as individuals. And that reflects the unique modes of serving the Eibishter that Jewish people have done, firstly as individuals and as generations, where there are different challenges and opportunities, and therefore different modes of service. This is key information for our conversation. At which point do the Jewish people take on individualized roles within Hashem's plan for the world? The Golus and its subsequent Gula from Mitzrayim. Continues from there through the 6,000 years of the world prior to Mashiach. Where there are different approaches, different paths of how to serve the Eibishter. And all of them valid. And then there has to be a bridge that links us in our personalized experience of Judaism with the Eibishter, with the Avos in their, so to speak, core connection to Judaism. The Shvatim are the beginning of that divergence. So the Avos are the Avos of all the Jewish people, and the Shvatim are the heads of your Shevet. So you're starting to see a split. Was teilen sich in Yud Beis Shvatim. So the Shvatim are the first time that you start to see different channels. There are 12 different channels. That's why there were 12 paths in Kriyas Yamsuf. 12 different channels of how you're supposed to approach the Eibishter, and different groups are going to fit into those different channels. So we're now starting to see diversity. Was teilen sich in Yud Beis Shvatim, Yud Beis Shi'orim Udrachim and Avodas Hashem was kolecha b'msilosoi ya'aleh, and that is then reflected in 12 gates of access to Hashem. Therefore, you have 12 gates in the Beis Hamikdash and 12 different Neschois HaTfilah, etc. And each one rises in their path. But they are the Shiftei Yeshurun. They are doing what they're doing because of the input, influence, and direction of Yaakov Avinu. Und durch dem geworden is kein der Chibur zwischen die Pratim, aber das Abon mit den Klal, Maaseh Avos, that becomes the bridge. So there's us through the whole of history where we're doing our own unique modes of service of Hashem, obviously appropriately. You have Maaseh Avos, which is the core, the essence of what it means to serve the Eibishter, and Yaakov Avinu, who's creating the first steps of, it's Yaakov Avinu, creating the 12 channels that will allow individuality. That brings us to what is so unique about Parshas Vayeishev. In der Friedrich Seders Beteil von Parshas Lech und weiter, from Parshas Lech on, let's say wegen die Avos. The storyline is about the Avos. And all the Yolim Zadim Protim in Maaseh Avos, and all of the details of those stories are stories of the chapters of their stories, episodes of their stories. Mashenkin in Parshas Vayeishev is the Chiddush, the uniqueness of Parshas Vayeishev as a Seipzichonda, Sipaveng di Shvatim Azer Piuldos Vizazayne Bifnei Atzmam. Now we're starting to hear and read the story of what the Shvatim did as individuals. Und da sage ich, was der Teichen von der Parsha ist, die Sippe Vaschola, wie es ist zugekommen zu der Rede der Golus Mitzrayim. That's why this is the Parsha of getting into Mitzrayim, which is all about Golus, which is to bring us to Geula, because that's where you're going to see the uniqueness of all these different approaches to serving the Eibishter. As Chazal and the Gemara tell us, on the pasuk in this week's parasha, that Yaakov Avinu sent Yosef to go check up on his brothers. It says he sent him from Emek Chevron. Says the Gemara, what does that mean? It's that deep guidance and advice from the tzaddik buried in Chevron, who was told by the Eibishter, know that your children will be strangers in a foreign land. Rashi explains, that moment where Yaakov sends Yosef to check on his brothers, that is the first catalyst for going down into Mitzrayim and then being in Golus. And that's actually the beginning of the entire theme of the parasha. Because Das is Rosh HaSeder Rashi touched, it's already alluded to, as Rashi points out, in the beginning, opening line of the parasha, which says, Eila told us Yaakov, Yosef. These are the descendants of Yaakov. First it tells us Yosef, even though he's not the firstborn. Says Rashi, Ve'ela shall told us Yaakov, Eila Yeshuveim Gilguleim. What does it mean? It means that this is going to tell us the places that they settled and where they moved, the descendants of Yaakov, until they eventually settled property. Siba Rishoina, what's the first cause of all of this movement? Yosef Gomer, that Yosef is 17 and is favored by his father, etc. Rashi says it's because of this that they landed up going down into Mitzrayim. That's what Vayeishev is about, the divergence of the unique paths of the Shvatim, which happens primarily in the context of Golus. Weil The primary area where you see the work, investment, and success of the Shvatim, the children of Ma'aseh Avos, and therefore by extension all the other children of the Avos. Where's that? In Golus and Gulas Mitzrayim. Golus Mitzrayim is Kelal under Malchus V'Golios, considering that Golus Mitzrayim incorporates every future Golus, and Gulas Mitzrayim incorporates every future Geula. And Gulas Mitzrayim is a Sherish is Kelal under Geulas. Komtois, therefore, as in Parashas Vayeishev is the Ibegang from the Vayeishev to the Vayeishev Bonim. Vayeishev is the transfer, crossing the threshold from what we had in the previous parashiyos, which was the stories of the Avos, to this week's parasha, which is getting us into the stories of their children. And where is the staging ground of the avodah of the Shvatim, specifically in Golus and Geulas Mitzrayim? And that's why this parasha has to start with Yosef's dreams. The purpose of these dreams is not just to alert us to the fact that soon Yosef's going to be the superpower in Mitzrayim, but rather these are prophecies that speak about the fulfillment of that covenant that the Eibishter made with Avraham Avinu, the Golus Ugeula Shel Yisrael, which incorporates the Golus of the Jewish people in Mitzrayim and beyond, and the Geula from Mitzrayim and beyond. The other things discussed in this parasha is the Kavone dabei as das Sibren der Weg von durchfind der Gzeres ben Absalom nicht gekommen begolle in die Diburim Meister shel Yaakov v'Ashvotim. The other things that happen in the parasha are not things that are so clearly expressed in this conversation, in this action, so to speak, of Yaakov and the Shvatim. But this dream that Yosef has, this is not the story of Yehuda and his sons. This is a story of Nevuah. This incorporates everything that's going to happen in the story of the emergence of the Jewish people. So once we understand that there's this key where the Shvatim have to start forging the paths for individuality within Judaism, because that's how the Bonim can be effective. And when you realize that this dream of Yosef encapsulates all of that, because it's all going to play out in Golus Ugulas Mitzrayim, then we can understand the context of the envy of the brothers, but much more importantly for our conversation at this point, the fact that Yaakov Avinu records it. Let's remember that the Shvatim are all holy, right? They're the Shvatim of the Eibishter. There's no question that whatever envy they had of Yosef is not envy as you and I know it, God forbid. But especially when you contextualize it, as doin pasuk nach dem Sipach Lema steht, vayikanu boy Echav. Especially since the Torah tells us after Yosef relates his dreams that the brothers were envious of him. That's a unique word that's been used recently in Torah. Similar to when Rachel was envious of Leah, her sister, where the pshat is that she was envious of her good deeds. The envy that they have is not that they're jealous in a negative way. They're envious of the fact that they're getting a sign from on high that Yosef is a unique person. This is not an issue of envy. This is not an issue of malice. This is an issue of, wow, how could we serve Hashem like Yosef does? So what does that mean? We're at the point in history where we're now developing the unique paths of service of the Eibishter. The Shvatim are all going to be different. They're all going to have different approaches. Hey, mitzada gavra, sai as individuals. Because as we've said, after the Avos, you have these different levels of connection and approach to Hashem for the different Shvatim. As well as the reality is changing, the time is changing, the environment in which you're going to operate is changing. We're now changing to a new phase of history. They're going to Mitzrayim. It's the beginning of the fulfillment of Bris Ben Abasarim, which means that it's now the beginning of that unique kind of avodah that the Shvatim, the children of the Avos, are going to have to do in an inhospitable environment of Golus Mitzrayim, and then afterwards in the Gula that follows. So now that we're talking about different ways to serve the Eibishter, so now people start to become aware of, My way versus your way. Und bei jenem ist gewesen nirgends die Meile von seinem Madrege war bei der Protis. And needless to say, each of the Shvatim started to feel an attachment to their specific way of approaching and serving the Eibishter and feeling the greatness of that particular approach. Und der Rebbe, wenn es kommt, die Hiram und Meile B'Chalom Shel Yosef in dem Yisr Malis Avodah Shel Yosef. So now when there's evidence from on high through the dreams that Yosef has that Yosef's path of Avodah is superior, and that he's the one who's going to guide how we serve the Eibishter and Golus. That's why everybody else has to bow to him. Because that's what's going to bring the Geula. Naturally, everybody else is envious. We wish that our mode of avodah would be in that place. They're envious of the fact that the Eibishter's goal and intention will be fulfilled. How? Through Yosef's avodah. Especially when you consider that they knew that all of their paths and approaches were 100% authentic ways to serve the Eibishter. So there's an envy that he's got the way that's going to be superior, that's going to bring Gula. Therefore, the Torah tells us that Yaakov guarded this fact. It doesn't say that Yaakov clung to the dream or prophecy of Yosef. It says Hadover, the thing. By Yaakov also, because Yaakov is at the level of father, Yaakov is not feeling the distinctions in avodah that his sons are feeling. As the avodah that this type of avodah belongs to and is achieved by that shevet. Und the zweite avodah durcheinander shevet, and the other avodah belongs to that shevet. Und the avodah ikris al yedei Yosef, and therefore the superior or primary avodah is Yosef's. Shamas hadover. Yaakov Avinu is looking from the core where it's all one entity. So he records the thing, the davar atzmoi, which means the process and goal. Not the details of the process. The process is there's avodah to be done in Golus. The goal of that is a geula. Von Shemesh Gomer Li Yosef. That avodah is the sun, the moon, and the stars have to bow to Yosef. That's what Yaakov is focused on. Not how it affects each of the Shvatim and how they believe that their avodah would be the catalyst. Says ein inyan. It's one concept. The one concept is we're fulfilling the divine will. The kavana from the Vayeishev the Eibishter wants one thing, and that is that our world becomes his home. That's what's happening here. Over Mela, because that's how Yaakov Avinu is looking at it. Remember, he's at the level of the mind that is koilel, that contains the children within the brain of the father in such a way that the child doesn't yet have identity. So therefore, Yaakov Avinu just sees big picture, or the goal, or the core of the goal, rather than the specifics of who gets there in which way. Therefore, from Yaakov Avinu's perspective, you do not sense the worker, but the work. You do not sense the individual, but their achievement. Secondly, from Yaakov Avinu's perspective, every channel, every path is just purely sensing we're achieving the Eibishter's goal rather than we're achieving our unique purpose. With that, we can go back to the Medrash where Rabbi Levi says that he took this quill and started to write. As vidas is by in my Avos. What Yaakov is achieving here is he's got a very lofty perspective, the Avos perspective, where he just sees the whole thing as a singular organic process. So as I can in sein Befeual in der Protest from Protebnei he writes it down, he brings it down into the world. He keys it into each of the Shvatim that they too should be able to feel this even while doing their unique mode of service. And das the Pirushim because of Yom, Shah, Mokim. That explains why he didn't record the year or the month, but rather the day, hour, and time and place. Yaakov hat die alle Geluke Madreges na wurde eingestellt in ein Nekudas Hazman. What Yaakov is doing is he's taking all the broad rainbow of how you serve the Eibishter and encapsulating it in a single moment of time. And in ein Nekudas Mokim, and in a single piece of space, a single essence of DNA, if you wish, or core nucleus of an atom. What he's doing is he's distilling all of the avodah across all of time in all places into one single kernel. That's why he's not writing the year or the month, no yom and shah, but specifically days and hours. Like when Chazal say at that time, they don't mean in that hour. On the one hand, shah means at that moment when you say ba'isa shah. And it also means a whole period of time that is a single entity. Because he's not looking to record the date it happened, he's looking to record how everything is encapsulated in one moment of time. Everything is encapsulated in one concept of dedication. Is in as a result of Yaakov Avinu recording this, that causes that all the avodah of the children, wherever and whenever, that we should be able to sense, to experience how this avodah that I'm doing as me, belonging to my shevet, in my unique way, is how it's experienced from the perspective of the Avos. Which has two outcomes. Aleph, it's not so much about me. No, but it's about the work. That's what you feel. You feel the mission rather than the actor. You feel that this is all about the Eibishter's supernal will. Secondly, we also at all times are completely aware of the fact that what I'm doing is fulfilling the Eibishter's goal to make this world a holy place. That the world will become a place where the Eibush is recognized as the singular king, and the Eibush's name is one. So it's a very powerful lesson about having the capacity, while operating using our abilities to the maximum, yet feeling that it's not about our abilities, it's completely connecting to what the Eibush wants and to the Eibush's goal. Says Yodua, the Friedrich Rebbe writes, as the pasuk this pasuk that the brothers were envious, but the father recorded or guarded the secret or the fulfillment of the dream for the future, is linked to the Alter Rebbe, who had the envy of other personalities, and his geula, which obviously the Eibishter had, so to speak, guarded his dominance, that it should actually take place. No question, everything that has to do with the Rabbeim is precise. We have to say, the concept that we link this pasuk and its meaning to the Alter Rebbe's experience of Yitzchak Kislev, whatever we've just learned about the power of Yaakov Avinu recording the thing, in other words, seeing the core, the unity, the essence of the avodah, and bringing it down in a way that's accessible to all, has to somehow reflect in the Alter Rebbe story too. Shlomo the Bir in the explanation is this. We know that Chassidus, as it was manifested by the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid, is given by Klali, was the broadest form of Chassidus. Was der Fall ist in Seder Sfiras and the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid, and the zwei Bechinos und Sfiras HaKeser, Atik und Arich. That's why when we talk about the Sfiros and how each of the Rebbeim reflects one of the Sfiros, the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid are both in the world of Keser. The Baal Shem Tov is Atik, the higher, more aloof level, the core level of Keser, and the Magid, the more accessible level of Keser, Arich. The Alter Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe who then revealed to the world Chassidus Chabad, the Alter Rebbe took Chassidus from being something very broad and maybe a little bit abstract, and addressed it into the world of the rational, that we could understand it. Needless to say, when you have something which enters the realm of the intellectual, you start discerning different paths, different manifestations, different applications, not just simcha, not just emunah. And eventually, to the extent that every avodah has its own weight, its own value. The Giluf von Chassidus Chabad durch Alter Rebbe is aber nicht in an Eufen, was durch die Slapschuss von Chassidus und in Asaga ist der Fall geworden, Chas v'sholem ha'yerida in dem Eirach Chassidus. One of the biggest mistakes that people make is they believe that Chassidus Chabad made Chassidus accessible, made Chassidus simpler, made Chassidus, if you want to use the expression, almost like dumbed down. Chas v'sholem to say that. There is no reduction, there is no diminishing of the light, the power of Chassidus, because it's now explained in a way that we could understand. The Rabbi is given by the Avos Chassidus Aklolis and no Kloli. Not to think that the Baal Shem Tov and Maggid of Mezrich had this incredible Kloli, this blinding light of Chassidus, and now we have a toned down version. No. Not the Chassidus K'moshu is Nimshach Givorin in Hasaga. The Chiddush of Chassidus is to take the full intensity of Chassidus, as it was in the time of the Baal Shem Tov, and package that in a way that we could actually interpret it through the human brain, without losing anything. It's like Yaakov Avinu taking the whole concept of we're here to serve the Eibush and make the world a dir b'tachtonim, and writing it down so everybody could relate to it in their personal space. That's the truest meaning of taking the wellspring itself and spreading it to the most outer, distant place. We know that this avoid of spreading the Chassidus really took off after Yitzis Kislev. As the mayon atzmai, not nice spashus from mine. You take the spring, not water, bottled at source from the spring. Now the etzim for the mayonis. You take the essence of the springs, kumt on in chutzah, and that is delivered as is, unadulterated, unfiltered, at the furthest point. And really what chutzah really means is human intellect and human emotion, because that's as far as you could get from absolute bittul to the Eibishter. Now you need a bridge. How do you get that reality of the light as is, like the brain of the Father as is, to the world of individual streams of avodah? Translating Chassidus into what you understand, what I understand, what the next person understands. And which is similar to where the child becomes an independent child. What's the bridge? There had to be a special action taken by the Maggid of Mezrich. Similar to how Yaakov Avinu had to take action in order to link his very advanced experience of we're all in it just to serve the Eibishter, with our more tangible experience of I'm here using my abilities to the best of my abilities. So what was the event with the Maggid? Das was the Maggid hat Frau seine Stalkus angenommen dem Alten Rebbe's Hand und gesagt, just before the Maggid passed away, he took the Alten Rebbe's hand and he said, Yitzis Kislev is unser Hilula. Yitzis Kislev is our shared celebration. When es hat sich gedacht, in der Gilde von Chassidus in an Eufen von Yafutz meine Seichel Chutza, just as the Maggid is about to pass away, which means we're about to transition into a new avodah of spreading Chassidus at its source to the furthest place. At the time where the incredible power of Chassidus was now going to be distilled in a way that you could understand it, and understand it that you could energize yourself. Hat der Maggid gesagt, the Maggid framed it by telling the Alter Rebbe, this day is our shared celebration. Was damit hat sich aufgetan, der Chibur von dem Maggid atzmoi, is by Avos Chassidus. At that point you have the link between the Maggid as he is at the level of Avos Chassidus, like Yaakov Avinu, seeing things at their core, mit dem Mayonis, wie sie kommen on in Chutza, with the delivery of the package of Chassidus as it would be delivered through the Alter Rebbe's teachings in the furthest places. And of course, as we know, that through that, Ka'asi Mar, that brings Moshiach, and it's Hashem immediately.